The room glittered with gold and ambition. Crystal chandeliers dangled like frozen waterfalls over the grand imperial ballroom, each prism scattering light onto tuxedoed men and women wrapped in couture gowns. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided between tables, the air scented with champagne and roses flown in from Paris. It was the kind of night where fortunes were made, alliances sealed, and reputations either soared or collapsed under the unforgiving gaze of New York's elite. Tonight's gala was the crown jewel of the corporate social calendar, the annual Future Horizons Charity Ball, sponsored by Vance & Co., one of the largest real estate conglomerates in the country. At the center of it all stood one man, Arthur Vance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back hair and a smile sharpened for both cameras and boardrooms, he was the image of power. His voice boomed as he worked the room, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, shaking hands with politicians, hedge fund managers, and old-money heirs who could push his latest skyscraper project into the headlines. But tonight, Arthur had something, or rather someone, he was even more eager to show off. Her name was Sienna Clark, a 26-year-old former model turned brand ambassador for luxury car companies. She was stunning in a backless silver gown that clung to her like liquid metal, her dark hair cascading in perfect waves. And she was most definitely not Arthur's wife. The whispers had started the moment they walked in together. By the time Arthur took the stage to welcome his guests, the gossip had reached every corner of the ballroom. People weren't even trying to be discreet. Eyes flicked between Sienna and the conspicuous absence of Arthur's wife, Catherine Vance, who was 6 months pregnant and, as far as most of their circle knew, at home resting. Arthur basked in the attention like a cat in sunlight. He didn't just ignore the speculation, he leaned into it. He wrapped his arm around Sienna's waist, guiding her through clusters of investors, introducing her with a smirk that dared anyone to question him. It was cruel, calculated, and very, very public. Near the Champagne Tower, one of the city's gossip columnists whispered to a friend, "She's going to hear about this, the poor thing." She was about to do much more than hear about it. Halfway through the evening, just as Arthur was launching into an over-rehearsed speech about family values and building legacies for the next generation, the massive double doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open. The music faltered. Heads turned. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Standing there, framed by the golden light of the hallway, was Catherine. She wasn't in maternity loungewear. She wasn't pale and worn from pregnancy. She was radiant, a vision in an emerald silk gown that flowed around her like liquid night. The dress was cut to frame her rounded belly with pride, not hide it. Her blonde hair, usually pulled into a simple bun, spilled over her shoulders in glossy waves. Around her neck glimmered a diamond necklace no one had seen before, its fire catching the chandeliers above. On her arm was a man. Not just any man. Ethan Blackwell, the elusive billionaire investor whose net worth dwarfed Arthur's by billions. Tall, broad, and impeccably dressed in a midnight suit, Ethan's presence sent a ripple through the crowd. The cameras that had been clicking politely earlier now erupted into a frenzy of flashing light. Arthur froze mid-sentence. His eyes widened, his voice faltered for the first time all night. He had expected Catherine to stay home, humiliated and hidden. He hadn't counted on her walking into his event looking like the star of it, and certainly not with Ethan Blackwell at her side. Ethan leaned down and murmured something in Catherine's ear that made her laugh, a warm, confident sound that carried across the suddenly silent room. She didn't look at Arthur right away. Instead, she took her time, greeting old acquaintances, shaking hands with guests who rose from their seats in surprise and admiration. Every step she took seemed deliberate, measured, like a queen making her entrance. When she finally did meet Arthur's gaze, there was no sadness, no pleading, no trace of the woman he'd been mocking behind her back for months. Her eyes held something far more dangerous: composure. Arthur recovered enough to plaster on a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a chuckle, "it seems my lovely wife has decided to join us after all." A polite ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, but no one missed the tension crackling between them. Catherine stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and took the microphone from his hand with a grace that was somehow both gentle and commanding. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I wouldn't have missed this evening for the world." She turned to the audience, her smile bright. "Especially since Vance & Co. wouldn't be here tonight without the generosity of our sponsors. I'm honored to announce that this year's largest donor and new co-owner of the company is Ethan Blackwell." Gasps broke out. Arthur's face drained of color. "Co-owner?" Catherine let the words hang in the air, savoring the moment. She passed the microphone to Ethan, who spoke briefly about shared visions and future growth. But everyone in the room knew the real story. Arthur Vance had just been blindsided. Catherine didn't look at him again as she and Ethan stepped down from the stage, but she didn't have to. Every camera in the room was capturing the image that would be on the front page tomorrow. The pregnant wife who had walked into her husband's gala, hand in hand with a billionaire, and announced she now had a stake in his empire. And this was only the beginning. Long before the dazzling entrance at the gala, Catherine Vance was just Catherine Reed, a woman who believed that love could conquer anything. She was born in a quiet New England town, the kind where everyone knew your name, and the biggest excitement was the annual fall festival. Her parents, Helen and David Reed, owned a modest hardware store and lived in a 3-bedroom colonial with a creaky front porch. Money was tight, but their home was rich with laughter, Sunday dinners, and a belief in working hard for what you wanted. Catherine inherited her mother's warmth and her father's determination. She excelled in school, earned a scholarship to a prestigious university in Boston, and majored in business administration. Her dream was to one day start her own company, not necessarily something flashy, but something she could build with integrity, something that would make her parents proud. It was in her final semester that she met Arthur Vance. He wasn't a billionaire back then, just an ambitious young man working at a mid-sized real estate firm. He had that magnetic charm that could light up a room, and Catherine was drawn to his confidence. He talked about his big dreams, the skyscrapers he wanted to build, the empire he intended to create. She listened, captivated, believing she was meeting someone who shared her drive for success. Their relationship moved quickly. Arthur showered her with attention, late-night phone calls, surprise dinners, and promises of a future where they'd take on the world together. Catherine, who had always been cautious in love, let herself believe she'd found a true partner. When Arthur proposed a year later, it wasn't in some grand, showy gesture. They were having coffee at a little cafe near the harbor when he slipped a ring across the table saying, "Let's build our life together." She said yes, without hesitation. In the early years of their marriage, Catherine was Arthur's confidant and sounding board. She helped him refine his business pitches, proofread his proposals, and brainstorm strategies late into the night. When his company began to grow, she was the one handling the small details he often overlooked: scheduling, follow-ups, networking connections. She never took credit, always content to see him shine. But Arthur's rise in the business world changed things. As Vance & Co. expanded, the man who once talked about us began talking only about me. The long hours at the office turned into nights away. The thoughtful gestures became rare, replaced by expensive gifts that felt more like apologies than affection. Still, Catherine stayed. She believed in loyalty, in fighting for the marriage she'd vowed to protect. And when she discovered she was pregnant, she thought it might be the turning point they needed. The moment they'd reconnect, rebuild, and remember why they'd chosen each other. The early months of pregnancy were rough. Morning sickness, fatigue, and the quiet anxiety of stepping into motherhood. Catherine slowed her own career ambitions to focus on her health and the baby, fully expecting Arthur to be by her side. Instead, he seemed to drift further away. There were subtle changes at first. The way he'd glance at his phone when she was talking. The business trips that didn't quite match the company's calendar. The scent of perfume on his jackets that wasn't hers. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress, to the demands of his growing empire. Then came the cruelest cut, the gradual shift from neglect to mockery. Arthur began making little jokes at her expense in public, commenting on her comfortable maternity clothes, rolling his eyes when she declined wine at dinner parties, even joking to his friends that she was retired now. It hurt more than she ever admitted. Catherine had given up a promising career trajectory, poured her time and energy into supporting him, and now he saw her as nothing more than a decorative accessory. She confided in her best friend Lila, who had known her since college. "He doesn't see me anymore," Catherine admitted one rainy afternoon over tea. "It's like I've disappeared." "You haven't disappeared," Lila said firmly. "He's just blind, and one day he's going to regret underestimating you." Those words stuck with her. What Arthur never realized, what no one in his circle realized, was that Catherine had never truly abandoned her own ambitions. She had quietly maintained a portfolio of investments, using the savings from her early career and a small inheritance from her grandmother. She kept her business skills sharp through consulting work done discreetly under her maiden name. By the time she was 6 months pregnant, Catherine wasn't just the woman he thought stayed home all day. She was the silent owner of several prime properties, the majority shareholder in a boutique tech firm, and had quietly been building relationships with people like Ethan Blackwell, not romantically, but through shared philanthropic initiatives. Ethan, in particular, had been impressed by her sharp mind and strategic vision during charity board meetings. Over coffee one afternoon, he'd said, "You know, Catherine, if you ever wanted to step into the spotlight, you'd leave half the so-called business leaders in this city in the dust." She had laughed then, but the seed was planted. So when Lila sent her a text the night of the gala, "He's here with her, in public," Catherine didn't crumble. She didn't hide. She called Ethan, and together they decided on an entrance that would rewrite the story Arthur had been trying to tell. The woman who walked into that ballroom in part 1 wasn't just a wife defending her dignity. She was a strategist unveiling her opening move. And Arthur had no idea how much more she had planned. The world Arthur and Catherine lived in was not one of modest dinner parties or weekend getaways to the countryside. It was a high-stakes, high-visibility battlefield where perception was as valuable as profit. New York City's elite operated in a bubble. One part glittering privilege, one part ruthless competition. Every gala, charity auction, and industry conference was more than just a social gathering. It was a stage. Deals worth millions were whispered over champagne, and reputations could be made or destroyed with a single careless comment in the wrong ear. Vance & Co. had become one of the most visible players in that arena. Their luxury developments dotted the skyline, glass and steel monoliths that symbolized Arthur's ambition. Each project came with glossy PR campaigns, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and exclusive previews for the city's power brokers. Arthur thrived in that environment, basking in the attention, navigating the political games with ease. Catherine, for much of their marriage, had been a silent observer of that world. She'd attended the galas, smiled politely, and played the part of the supportive spouse. She'd seen the backroom deals, the subtle alliances formed between rivals, the way old money families guarded their influence while new money upstarts clawed for a seat at the table. What most people didn't know was that Catherine had been quietly learning from it all. She listened more than she spoke, noted who could be trusted and who couldn't, memorized the power dynamics between key players. She knew which philanthropists actually cared about their causes and which used charity as a tax write-off. She knew which CEOs were over-leveraged, which politicians could be swayed, and which journalists could be counted on to leak a story at the right time. It was in that glittering yet cutthroat ecosystem that Ethan Blackwell moved like a ghost, powerful, respected, but deliberately elusive. While Arthur sought the spotlight, Ethan seemed to own it without ever asking for it. His empire spanned multiple industries: renewable energy, shipping, aerospace technology. He had the resources to build skyscrapers if he wanted, but preferred investments that influenced entire sectors rather than single city blocks. Catherine had first met Ethan at a charity board meeting for the Hamilton Foundation, an organization dedicated to funding STEM programs for underprivileged youth. The meeting was in a penthouse conference room overlooking Central Park, the kind of setting where expensive suits and understated watches signaled more wealth than any logo ever could. Arthur hadn't been able to attend that day. Something about a critical investor lunch, so Catherine had gone alone, representing the family's philanthropic contributions. She remembered Ethan listening intently as she presented a proposal for integrating mentorship programs into existing school curricula. When she finished, he'd asked pointed, insightful questions, not the kind of polite fluff she was used to from Arthur's colleagues. Afterward, he'd approached her privately. "You think like an investor," he'd said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Ever considered stepping into the business world yourself?" Catherine had deflected at the time, laughing it off. But over the next year, their paths crossed again and again, at board meetings, charity dinners, and the occasional coffee catch-up. Ethan was never flirtatious, never inappropriate, but he always listened, and he never underestimated her. In contrast, Arthur's treatment of Catherine within this same social sphere had grown colder. He'd begun attending events with associates like Sienna, introducing them as valuable members of the team, while relegating Catherine to the periphery. At one gala, he'd even joked to a potential investor, "Catherine's retired now. Her biggest boardroom is the nursery." The man had laughed. Catherine had smiled, but inside, she'd filed it away as one more crack in the facade. That's why the Future Horizons charity ball was so important. It wasn't just another gala. This event attracted media from across the country, major political figures, and international investors. Deals worth billions were known to be seated in casual conversations here. Arthur had been preparing for weeks, telling anyone who would listen that this would be his defining night. The venue itself was the Grand Imperial Ballroom, a place steeped in old money tradition. Towering ceilings painted with Renaissance-style frescoes, gold leaf detailing on every column, a stage flanked by marble staircases where the host could descend like royalty. The guest list read like a who's who of finance, real estate, and politics. Senators, tech moguls, art patrons, even a former president rumored to be considering another run for office. For Arthur, it was the perfect arena to display his dominance. For Catherine, it was the perfect stage to dismantle him. In the days leading up to the ball, Catherine had made her own quiet preparations. She arranged private meetings with key investors, some of whom had grown weary of Arthur's arrogance. She spoke to reporters she trusted, dropping just enough hints to spark curiosity without revealing her plan. And most importantly, she finalized the deal with Ethan to acquire a controlling interest in one of Vance & Co.'s most critical subsidiaries, a deal Arthur didn't even know was on the table. The symbolism was irresistible, walking into his event not just as his wife, but as his new business equal. Her emerald gown had been custom-made for the night, chosen not just for beauty but for what it represented: wealth, power, renewal. The diamonds at her neck weren't from Arthur. They'd been a gift from her late grandmother, passed down with the words, "Wear these when you're ready to show the world who you are." The night of the gala, as her driver navigated through the glittering streets of Manhattan, Catherine looked out at the city skyline. Arthur's towers stood tall among the others, their glass facades reflecting the lights of the city. She didn't feel small looking at them anymore. She felt ready. When the car pulled up to the red carpet, reporters jostled for position. Flashes popped. At first, they thought Ethan's presence was the story. But as Catherine stepped out, visibly pregnant yet radiating unshakable confidence, they realized the bigger headline was the woman herself. Inside the ballroom, she could already hear Arthur's voice echoing over the speakers, smooth and self-assured. He thought he was about to give the speech of his career. He had no idea the real show was about to begin. If Catherine was the quiet strategist, Arthur Vance was the showman. From the moment he stepped into the real estate industry, Arthur treated every boardroom like a stage, and every deal like a performance. He had the kind of charm that could disarm a room full of hardened executives. A quick wit, a confident smile, and just enough self-deprecating humor to make him seem approachable. But beneath that polished exterior was a man obsessed with power. Arthur didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to dominate. He collected influence the way some men collected art, not for its beauty, but for what it said about him. Every handshake was calculated, every dinner invitation a step toward another acquisition. He measured his worth not in dollars, but in how many people would stand when he entered a room. In the early years of their marriage, Catherine had admired that drive. She saw it as ambition, the same quality she had in her own way. But over time, she realized Arthur's hunger for success wasn't about building something lasting. It was about feeding his ego. The more he climbed, the more he looked down on everyone else, including her. Arthur's need for validation was what led him to Sienna Clark. Sienna was the kind of woman Arthur believed should be on his arm when he made his grand appearances. She was a vision. Tall, willowy, with a face that looked like it had been crafted for magazine covers. Her career as a model had peaked a few years earlier, but she'd reinvented herself as a luxury brand consultant, which in practice meant she was paid to mingle at high-end events and be seen in all the right places. Arthur met her at a private launch party for a luxury car brand. Catherine had been invited but had declined, citing exhaustion from her pregnancy. That left Arthur free to work the room alone, and he spotted Sienna by the champagne fountain, wearing a red satin dress that all but demanded attention. They were a match in certain ways. Sienna craved the lifestyle Arthur could offer: penthouses, private jets, weekends in Saint-Tropez. Arthur craved the validation of having someone like Sienna draped over his arm, someone who would laugh at his jokes, flatter his ego, and never challenge him in public. It started discreetly. Late-night texts, business meetings that ran too long, a weekend trip to Miami for a development conference that didn't quite line up with any conference schedules. Catherine noticed the changes: the cologne he hadn't worn before, the way he'd linger over his phone with a half-smile. But when she asked, Arthur brushed her off. "You're imagining things," he said once, irritation creeping into his voice. "You've been cooped up too long. Focus on the baby." It wasn't just the affair that cut deep, it was the mockery. Arthur began making subtle jabs at Catherine in public, framing them as jokes. At a dinner with investors when she declined wine, he quipped, "Ah, she's in mom mode now. Doesn't get out much." At another event, when someone complimented her dress, he smirked. "She used to have a whole closet of those. Now it's all stretchy waistbands." Sienna, of course, played her role perfectly. She'd smile sweetly at Catherine when they crossed paths, offering a feigned politeness that made the disrespect sting even more. At one charity brunch, she accidentally spilled coffee near Catherine's seat, apologizing with a tone that somehow made it sound like Catherine was the one in the way. But the most humiliating moment, before the gala, came 2 weeks earlier at a smaller industry event. Catherine hadn't been planning to attend, but a last-minute schedule change put her there. Arthur arrived late, walking in with Sienna at his side. He didn't introduce Catherine to her. He didn't even acknowledge her presence until a mutual acquaintance said, "Arthur, isn't this your wife?" Arthur had laughed lightly. "Yes, of course. Catherine, meet Sienna. She's helping us with branding on the new project." The way he said it, like Catherine was just another contact, not his partner, told her everything she needed to know. From that point on, Sienna seemed emboldened. She would post carefully staged photos on social media. Arthur's hand on hers at a dinner table, their matching sunglasses on a yacht deck, a close-up of a champagne toast with the caption, "Power Moves." The gossip blogs picked it up. Catherine didn't respond. Not yet. Sienna, for all her poise, underestimated Catherine. She thought Catherine was like the other discarded wives she'd seen in this world. Women who faded quietly into the background while their ex-husbands paraded new partners. She didn't realize Catherine had resources, allies, and a plan. Arthur, too, miscalculated. He thought Catherine's absence from certain events meant she was retreating. He didn't see the quiet meetings, the contracts being drawn, the shares being transferred. He didn't see that the woman he'd been underestimating for months had positioned herself to land the single most devastating blow to his career. By the time the Future Horizons charity ball rolled around, Arthur was riding high. He'd told friends this was going to be the night we make history. And by we, he meant himself and Sienna. She had chosen a silver gown for the event, knowing it would sparkle under the chandeliers. Arthur had even hinted to a few guests that there would be a big surprise during his speech. There was a big surprise, all right, just not the one he'd planned. When Catherine walked in that night, Arthur's mind raced. He hadn't expected her to show up at all, let alone on the arm of Ethan Blackwell. His first instinct was to pretend it didn't matter, to act as though she was just there to play her part as his wife for the cameras. But when she took the microphone and made her announcement, he felt the ground shift under his feet. In that moment, Arthur realized something he'd never considered. Catherine wasn't just his wife. She was his competition, and she just outplayed him in front of the most powerful people in the city. The air inside the Grand Imperial Ballroom was thick with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Champagne flutes clinked in delicate toasts, and the low hum of conversation swirled under the music from the string quartet. On the surface, it was just another glittering evening in New York's elite social calendar. But for Catherine Vance, every second felt like walking through a minefield. She'd arrived with Ethan Blackwell to a storm of camera flashes, the emerald gown flowing around her like a banner. Every step had been calculated. Chin up, shoulders back, the faintest smile that gave nothing away. She'd shaken hands, accepted congratulations, and even made small talk with people she knew had been whispering about her for months. Still, she knew the moment of collision was coming. Arthur was holding court near the stage, surrounded by investors, politicians, and Sienna, who stood just half a step behind him, perfectly positioned to be in every photo. Sienna's silver gown caught the light, throwing sharp glints across the polished floor. She was laughing at something, Arthur said, her hand resting on his arm in a way that declared possession. The moment Catherine stepped into his line of sight, a ripple passed through the group. Arthur's smile faltered for half a heartbeat, then reassembled itself, tighter and more brittle. Sienna's eyes narrowed, her expression flickering between surprise and calculation. "Catherine," Arthur said when she reached them, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "You look unexpected." A polite chuckle went through the group, the kind of hollow sound people make when they sense drama, but don't want to be caught openly enjoying it. "I could say the same," Catherine replied smoothly, letting her gaze sweep over Sienna before returning to Arthur. "I didn't realize this event required brand ambassadors." Sienna's smile froze. Arthur's eyes flashed, but before he could respond, one of the investors stepped in with a forced laugh, trying to steer the conversation back to business. Catherine let them. For now. But then came the toast. Arthur had arranged for a short speech before the main auction began. It was supposed to be his moment, the peak of the night, where he'd unveil a new luxury development and cement his image as the city's most visionary developer. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, standing on the small stage with Sienna at his side, "tonight is not just about charity, though that is a noble cause. It's about vision, about building a future worthy of the next generation." He gestured to Sienna. "I'm proud to have by my side someone who represents that future, someone who has brought fresh ideas, energy, and style to Vance & Co., Miss Sienna Clark." The applause was polite, but the undertone was unmistakable. People glanced toward Catherine, gauging her reaction. She stood at a table near the front, her hand resting lightly on her champagne glass, her face unreadable. Arthur wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, "Sienna has been instrumental in our latest project. You'll be seeing much more of her in the months ahead." It was a calculated humiliation, a public acknowledgement of his mistress's role in the company, delivered in front of Catherine and half the city's power players. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Catherine felt the heat rise in her chest, but she kept her expression cool. Let him think he'd won this round. Then Arthur made his mistake. "And as for my wife," he said, turning toward her with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, "she's been enjoying some well-deserved time away from the business, preparing for motherhood. A full-time job, of course." The implication was clear. Catherine had stepped back, become irrelevant. The smattering of laughter from certain corners was sharp and cutting. That was when Ethan moved. He didn't rush, didn't make a scene, just stepped forward, his presence commanding enough to draw the attention of every camera in the room. He extended a hand to Catherine, helping her onto the stage with the kind of quiet gallantry that made Arthur's display look cheap in comparison. Catherine took the microphone from Arthur without asking. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "Thank you, Arthur. It's true I've been preparing for motherhood, and I'm honored to soon bring a child into this world. But I've also been preparing for something else." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the audience. As of this morning, I am the majority shareholder of Vance & Co.'s residential division. The shock was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of programs as people turned to each other in disbelief. Arthur's face went pale, the smirk wiped clean. Catherine smiled faintly. I believe in the future of this company. I also believe in accountability. That's why I'll be taking an active role in ensuring our projects reflect the values we claim to stand for. She didn't look at Sienna, but the silence from that side of the stage was deafening. Then she handed the microphone to Ethan, and with the partnership of Blackwell Industries, we'll ensure those values are backed by the resources to make them a reality. Ethan's short remarks barely registered with the audience. They were too busy processing what had just happened. In the span of 2 minutes, Catherine had flipped the narrative. She wasn't the humiliated wife anymore. She was the woman who'd just outmaneuvered her husband on his own stage. As she stepped down, the cameras followed her. Investors who had been circling Arthur now gravitated toward her, eager to shake her hand. The music started again, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Arthur stood frozen on the stage, Sienna at his side, both of them blinking under the bright lights. Whatever victory they'd imagined for the night had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality that Catherine now held the upper hand. And everyone knew it. The applause from the gala still echoed in Catherine's ears as the car pulled away from the Grand Imperial Ballroom. The city outside was a blur of neon lights and slick black pavement, but inside the sedan, the air was heavy and still. Ethan sat beside her, his expression unreadable, giving her the silence she needed. Her hands trembled in her lap. She wasn't sure if it was adrenaline, exhaustion, or the weight of everything that had just happened. She'd stood in front of New York's elite and stripped Arthur of his unchallenged dominance, but the momentary rush of victory was already fading, replaced by something colder and sharper. It wasn't over. You handled yourself perfectly, Ethan said finally, his voice low. He didn't see it coming. Catherine managed a faint smile. No, but that doesn't mean he won't retaliate. She knew Arthur too well. He wasn't the kind of man to lick his wounds quietly. Public humiliation would only make him more dangerous. And now that she'd openly claimed a controlling interest in part of his company, she'd moved from being a personal embarrassment to a professional threat. When they reached her building, Ethan walked her to the door. Rest tonight, he said. We'll talk strategy in the morning. Rest. The word felt foreign. Inside her penthouse, the quiet was oppressive. Catherine kicked off her heels and walked through the dimly lit living room, past the carefully arranged furniture Arthur had once insisted on importing from Italy. It all looked sterile now, like a stage set for a life she no longer lived. She poured herself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen island, and finally let the tears come. They weren't loud, sobbing tears, just silent streams that traced down her cheeks, carrying months of swallowed hurt with them. Her mind kept replaying every moment that had led here. The nights Arthur didn't come home, the jokes at her expense. The way Sienna had stood beside him tonight, owning a space that should have been hers. Even though Catherine had turned the tables, the wounds were still raw. She pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the baby shift inside her. We're going to be okay, she whispered. I promise you that. But promises were easy to make in the quiet of her own kitchen. The hard part was figuring out how to keep them. Sleep was impossible. She paced the apartment, her mind spinning through possibilities. Arthur would likely call an emergency board meeting. He'd try to buy her out, paint her as an unfit investor, maybe even dig into her finances to find something he could use against her. And Sienna, she'd double down on her presence, leaking stories to the press, framing Catherine as bitter and jealous. By 3 in the morning, Catherine had abandoned the idea of rest entirely. She sat at her desk, a sleek glass slab in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, and began drafting a list. Not of revenge, not yet, but of stability. Secure her shares legally beyond dispute. Build direct relationships with the division's top executives. Identify allies on the board. Control the media narrative before Arthur could. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Enjoy your little stunt tonight. Won't last. She didn't need to ask who it was from. She deleted it without replying. By dawn, Catherine felt the exhaustion seep into her bones. She made tea, sat on the couch and stared out at the skyline. It was strange. The towers Arthur had built didn't intimidate her anymore. They were just buildings. What mattered was who controlled them. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Lila, holding 2 paper bags and a large coffee. "I figured you'd be up," she said, stepping inside. Catherine smiled for the first time in hours. "You figured right?" They sat together in the kitchen, Lila unpacking fresh croissants and fruit. "You were incredible last night," she said between bites. "The way you just took that microphone." Arthur looked like he'd swallowed glass. Catherine let out a short laugh. "It felt good. For about 5 minutes. Lila's expression softened. "It's okay to crash after something like that. You've been holding it together for months. Now you need to think about what's next." "I already am," Catherine said, pushing her empty plate away. "Arthur's going to come after me, and he's not going to play fair. I need to be ahead of him every step of the way." Lila nodded. "Then you need more than just Ethan. You need your own team." The idea settled in Catherine's mind. She'd been operating alone, leaning on Ethan for major moves. But if she was going to survive this, she needed people loyal to her. Not to Arthur, not to the company, just to her. "I know who I can call," Catherine said slowly. "People I've worked with on other projects. People who owe me favors." Lila leaned forward. "Then do it. And Catherine? What? Don't forget to take care of yourself in all this. You're not just fighting for the company. You're fighting for you and that baby." Catherine placed a hand on her belly again. She could feel a strange mix of fear and resolve settling in her chest. The humiliation she'd endured wasn't going to break her. If anything, it had stripped away the last of her hesitation. Arthur had underestimated her for the last time. She was done playing defense. Arthur believed that what happened at the gala was the endgame. That Catherine had played her single dramatic card by aligning with Ethan Blackwell and claiming a share of Vance & Co. What he didn't know was that the gala had only been Catherine's opening move. 3 days after the event, Catherine arrived at the offices of Vance & Co. Its residential division, the one she now controlled, dressed in a tailored navy suit that made her look less like the retired wife Arthur had painted her to be and more like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she walked through the glass doors, her presence turning heads. The executives she passed greeted her cautiously. They'd heard the rumors that she'd staged a takeover with Blackwell's backing, that Arthur was furious, that the company was about to split into factions. Most didn't know where to stand yet. She intended to make that choice easy for them. At the morning board meeting, Catherine laid out a detailed growth plan for the division. New sustainability initiatives, affordable luxury housing in emerging markets, strategic partnerships with tech firms to integrate smart living features. She spoke with authority, citing market data, projected ROI, and potential government incentives. By the time she finished, even the skeptics in the room were leaning forward. She wasn't a figurehead. She was a leader. But the real twist came after the meeting. In her office, a corner suite with sweeping views of the city, Catherine opened her laptop and logged into a secured account. Inside was a portfolio Arthur didn't know existed. It contained holdings in 3 international real estate firms, 2 boutique investment banks, and a controlling stake in a logistics company that supplied building materials to several of Vance & Co.'s competitors. These weren't Ethan's investments. They were hers, built quietly over years under her maiden name, Reed, using a network of trusts and shell companies. She'd started small, reinvesting every profit, leveraging her knowledge from years of watching Arthur do the same. And now she was in a position to use those assets strategically. Lila arrived that afternoon with coffee and a grin. "I just heard from one of Arthur's guys," she said. "He's been calling emergency meetings all week. Apparently, he's trying to figure out how you got the money for your stake in the company." Catherine smiled faintly. "Let him wonder." "Are you going to tell him?" Lila asked. "Eventually, but not yet. First, I want to see how he reacts when I start showing up in places he never expected me to be." That night, she attended a private dinner hosted by a major city developer, the kind of event Arthur considered his personal territory. She arrived on the arm of a tech CEO whose company had recently partnered with her logistics firm. The message was clear. Catherine wasn't just stepping into Arthur's world. She was building her own network, one that overlapped with his, in ways that would force him to deal with her. The following week, she made another move. Acquiring a prime piece of waterfront property Arthur had been eyeing for months. She didn't do it through Vance & Co., but through one of her other companies, which promptly announced plans for a mixed-use development that would compete directly with Arthur's project. The press noticed. From silent partner to industry disruptor, Catherine Vance's stunning business moves, read one headline. Another was less subtle. Arthur Vance faces off against his own wife in high-stakes property battle. Arthur's calls began coming in after that. First, they were polite, requests to talk things through. Then they turned sharper, accusing her of overstepping, of trying to sabotage him. Catherine listened without rising to the bait. "You told the world I was irrelevant," she said calmly during one call. "I'm just proving you wrong." The real bombshell came 2 weeks later. Arthur was preparing for a major investor presentation when he discovered that Catherine's logistics company had signed exclusive supply contracts with 2 of the largest construction material providers in the region. Without those contracts, Arthur's upcoming projects would face delays and increased costs, potentially costing him millions. He confronted her in the lobby of a high-end hotel where she was meeting with international investors. Cameras caught the moment. Arthur striding toward her, anger written across his face, and Catherine turning to greet him with a cool smile. "Nice to see you, Arthur," she said, her tone perfectly civil. "I hope you've been well." "You're deliberately undermining my projects," he hissed. "I'm running my businesses," she replied. "If they happen to compete with yours, well, the market rewards the best, doesn't it?" The footage went viral. In every frame, Catherine looked composed, while Arthur looked rattled. Public perception began to shift. The narrative was no longer humiliated wife strikes back. It was Catherine Vance, rising power player. Ethan watched all of this with quiet approval. Over dinner one evening, he said, "You know, Catherine, you've built something much bigger than just a revenge play. You're building an empire." She didn't deny it. For the first time in months, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of just away from the pain Arthur had caused. And the truth, the one no one but Lila and Ethan knew, was that she wasn't done. Her portfolio was larger than anyone suspected, her alliances deeper, her plans longer term. Arthur thought he was fighting for survival now, but he still hadn't seen the full scope of what she had in her arsenal. The gala had been her opening move. The game was only just beginning. The Catherine who had once slipped quietly into the background was gone. In her place stood a woman who commanded every room she entered, and she made sure the world saw it. It began with her appearance. Catherine had always been elegant, but now she was deliberate. Every outfit was a calculated statement. Crisp tailored suits in bold colors for board meetings, floor-length gowns with clean, architectural lines for galas, minimalist jewelry that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. The emerald gown from the gala had been the start. Now, every public appearance was a chapter in a visual narrative. Power, confidence, control. Her hair, once worn in soft waves or pulled into practical ponytails, now framed her face in sharp, sophisticated styles. Her makeup was flawless but never heavy, a perfect balance that made her look untouchable. Even her posture had shifted. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, every movement measured. But the transformation wasn't just external. Catherine's mindset had changed in ways that were even more striking. She no longer asked for space at the table. She took it. She spoke in boardrooms with a calm authority that silenced interruptions. She turned down deals that didn't meet her terms, no matter how prestigious the offer. She also became a master of the media. With Lila's help, she hired a top-tier PR strategist who understood how to shape public perception. They orchestrated interviews, carefully timed press releases, and curated photo ops that showcased her as a leader in both business and philanthropy. Soon, magazines were calling her the new face of real estate innovation and the power player redefining the industry. One particularly impactful moment came when she appeared on the cover of Metropolitan Business Weekly. The photo showed her standing on a rooftop, the city skyline behind her, wearing a white suit and a confident half-smile. The headline read, "Catherine Vance, building more than towers, building a legacy. The article detailed her investments, her sustainability initiatives, and her commitment to affordable luxury housing, all while subtly contrasting her approach with Arthur's flashy, profit-first methods. It was a PR masterpiece, positioning her as the visionary and Arthur as the outdated mogul. Her social life evolved too. Catherine began hosting her own events, intimate dinners for key investors, charity galas under her own name, art exhibitions where she mingled with cultural elites. These gatherings weren't just social, they were strategic. Every guest was chosen for a reason, every conversation a thread in the network she was weaving. Ethan remained a constant presence, though their relationship still lived in the realm of speculation. They appeared together at functions often enough to fuel rumors, but never confirmed anything. Catherine liked it that way. The ambiguity kept people talking, and it kept Arthur guessing. Arthur, for his part, tried to match her moves. He ramped up his own media appearances, increased the flashiness of his events, and paraded Sienna on his arm at every opportunity. But the more he tried to compete on her level, the more it became clear he was reacting, not leading. The contrast between them was stark. Catherine was shaping the narrative, Arthur was chasing it. The shift in power became undeniable at the annual Real Estate Leaders Summit. It was an event Arthur had dominated for years, delivering keynote speeches that drew standing ovations. This year, Catherine was the keynote speaker. She took the stage in a deep blue suit, the room packed with industry heavyweights. Her speech was direct but inspiring, focused on innovation, sustainability, and community impact. She spoke about the need for the industry to evolve beyond pure profit, to think about the future they were building for the next generation. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. Even Arthur's allies were on their feet. Cameras flashed as she stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with other executives, some of whom Arthur had considered his inner circle. Later that evening, as she stood on the balcony of the reception hall, looking out over the city lights, Ethan joined her. "You've changed," he said, studying her profile. "I've become who I was supposed to be," she replied. He smiled. "And Arthur? He's becoming what he made me feel like for years. Irrelevant." The transformation was complete in the eyes of the public, but Catherine knew there was one more step. She hadn't just rebuilt herself, she'd built momentum, and now she was ready to use it. The next move wouldn't just be about business, it would be personal, and it would be public. Because Catherine wasn't content with taking her place in the industry, she was going to take Arthur's place entirely, and make sure the world saw it happen. The perfect stage for Catherine's final move came in the form of the Global Urban Development Gala, an international event hosted in New York that brought together the most influential figures in real estate, finance, and politics. Heads of state attended. Billionaire investors flew in on private jets. The media covered it as if it were the Oscars of the business world. Arthur had been one of the gala's star attractions for years, using it to showcase his latest projects and charm potential partners. This year, he was scheduled to unveil an ambitious multi-billion-dollar waterfront redevelopment, a project he believed would cement his legacy. But Catherine had other plans. Weeks before the event, she and Ethan quietly moved to secure a majority stake in the land Arthur's project depended on. It was a complicated deal involving multiple shell companies, discrete buyouts, and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. By the time Arthur stepped onto the stage at the gala, he didn't know that the very foundation of his project no longer belonged to him. The night of the gala, the ballroom shimmered with gold accents and crystal chandeliers. Guests in tuxedos and gowns mingled beneath towering floral arrangements. Cameras flashed as Catherine arrived with Ethan, wearing a sleek black gown with a plunging neckline and diamond earrings that caught every glint of light. She radiated power, calm, poised, utterly unshakable. Arthur was already at the front of the room, greeting guests with Sienna on his arm. Catherine noted the tightness in his smile when he saw her. He didn't know exactly what she had planned, but he knew enough to be uneasy. The speeches began, awards were handed out, and finally, Arthur took the stage. The massive screens behind him lit up with renderings of gleaming towers, green spaces, and waterfront promenades. The audience murmured in appreciation. "This," Arthur declared, his voice booming, "is the future of our city, a place where commerce, culture, and community come together. Construction begins in 6 months." The applause was immediate, but Catherine waited. She knew her moment was coming. The evening's host stepped up to thank Arthur and transitioned to the next segment, a surprise announcement from one of the event's platinum sponsors. That sponsor was Catherine's company. She rose from her seat and walked to the stage, the click of her heels echoing in the sudden hush. Taking the microphone, she smiled at the audience. "Thank you," she began. "I'd like to share some exciting news. Over the past month, my partners and I have been finalizing plans for a groundbreaking waterfront project, one that will redefine sustainable urban living." Behind her, the screens changed. New renderings appeared, strikingly similar to Arthur's, but with significant differences in design and branding. The heading read, "Blackwell and Reed Development Group." A murmur swept through the room. Catherine continued, her tone warm but firm. "This project will feature state-of-the-art green technology, affordable luxury housing, and public spaces designed to bring communities together. I'm proud to announce that we now own the majority of the land required for its development." She paused, letting the words sink in. "We look forward to collaborating with the city to ensure this project serves both economic growth and the people who live here." Arthur's face in the crowd was a study in shock and fury. He knew what she'd just done. She had taken his project, his dream, and made it hers, and she had done it in front of everyone who mattered. The host, clearly caught off guard, stumbled through an attempt to transition, but the cameras were locked on Catherine. The room was buzzing, investors leaning toward each other, whispering. After the announcement, as Catherine stepped down from the stage, Arthur intercepted her near the edge of the ballroom. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his smile frozen for the nearby photographers. "Building the future," she said evenly. "Something you taught me to do, though I've learned to do it better." "You can't," he started. "I already have," she cut in. "And you should be careful, Arthur. The more you fight this, the more public it gets. And I think we both know who the press favors right now." She walked away before he could respond, joining Ethan in a cluster of international investors. Behind her, she could feel the shift. Arthur was no longer the center of the room. She was. By the end of the night, social media was ablaze with headlines. Catherine Vance outmaneuvers ex-husband at global gala. From betrayed wife to real estate queen, Catherine's stunning takeover. For Catherine, it wasn't just about taking Arthur's project. It was about making sure the entire world saw the transfer of power. About ensuring that his fall from grace was as public as the humiliation he'd once tried to inflict on her. And as she left the gala, flashbulbs popping around her, she knew one thing for certain. Arthur was finished. The morning after the Global Urban Development Gala, Catherine's face was on every major business and lifestyle publication. Headlines praised her strategic genius, her composure, and her rise from discarded wife to queen of the industry. The photographs told the story even better. Arthur in the background, tense and grim, while Catherine stood poised, surrounded by allies. In her penthouse, Catherine sat at the breakfast table, sipping tea as sunlight spilled across the marble floors. The city skyline stretched out before her. Towers, bridges, and now a waterfront that would soon bear her name. She thought about how far she had come from that night months ago, when she'd stood in the same city feeling small, unseen, and humiliated. Now she was anything but invisible. Lila arrived mid-morning, tossing a copy of the Financial Journal on the table. Catherine's photo was on the cover, with the headline, "Catherine Vance, Redefining Power and Success." "You've officially won," Lila said with a grin. Catherine shook her head. "This was never about winning. It was about taking back my voice and making sure no one could ever take it again." Later that week, Catherine was invited to speak at the Women in Leadership Conference, a high-profile event attended by executives, entrepreneurs, and young women aspiring to break barriers in their fields. Standing backstage, she could hear the buzz of hundreds of conversations, the hum of anticipation. When she stepped out onto the stage, the applause was immediate and heartfelt. She wore a cream-colored suit, her hair swept back, her expression serene but resolute. She began simply, A year ago, I was a woman who thought her value came from the person standing beside her. I thought being loyal, quiet, and supportive was enough. And then one night, in front of a room full of people, I was reminded exactly how wrong I was. The room was silent, listening. I was mocked, dismissed, treated as though I had nothing to contribute, as though I was just decoration. Her gaze swept across the crowd. But here's the truth. No one can make you irrelevant unless you hand them the power to do so. And I realized that night I'd been giving away my power for years. She spoke about the months that followed, not in petty detail, but in terms of resilience, strategy, and self-respect. She talked about building her own businesses, surrounding herself with people who valued her vision, and refusing to let her past define her future. I didn't take back my life by waiting for an apology, she said. I took it back by becoming the kind of woman who doesn't need one. The applause that followed was long and loud. Some women stood, clapping with tears in their eyes. Catherine felt a surge of something deeper than victory. It was connection. She knew they understood. In the weeks after her speech, she received hundreds of messages from women across the world. Some were CEOs, some stay-at-home mothers, some students just starting out. They all said versions of the same thing. You reminded me that I matter. As for Arthur, his empire began to crumble. Investors pulled out of his waterfront project. The board questioned his leadership. Rumors swirled about internal disputes and financial instability. Sienna's social media went quiet, and soon she vanished from the city's social circuit entirely. Catherine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She had learned the most satisfying form of revenge wasn't watching someone fall. It was rising so high that their opinion no longer mattered. Months later, the whispers about Catherine and Ethan Blackwell turned into open speculation. Then came the announcement. It wasn't made through a press release or a staged magazine cover. Catherine and Ethan simply walked into the annual Blackwell Foundation dinner, hand in hand, Catherine wearing a sapphire ring so brilliant it seemed to hold its own light. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Social media lit up within minutes. Power couple alert. Catherine Vance and Ethan Blackwell engaged. 3 months later, the wedding took place in the gardens of Ethan's private estate in the Hamptons. It wasn't ostentatious, despite the billion-dollar guest list. Everything was elegant, timeless. White roses in crystal vases, a string quartet playing under a silk-draped pavilion, the ocean just beyond the hedges. Catherine wore a custom gown of silk and lace, her hair swept into a soft chignon, a diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. As she walked down the aisle, sunlight caught the tears in Lila's eyes. Ethan stood waiting, looking at her like she was the only person in the world. When the vows were exchanged, Catherine's voice was steady. I used to think my story ended the night I was humiliated in front of a crowd. But that night was just the prologue. You've shown me that true partnership is built on respect, trust, and believing in each other's vision. And I promise to protect that, always. Ethan's vows were simple. You've built an empire on your own strength, Catherine. I don't complete you, I stand beside you. Always. They sealed it with a kiss as the guests rose in applause. The reception was a blend of worlds. Tech billionaires, real estate moguls, artists, and activists mingling under strings of glowing lanterns. The menu was curated by Michelin star chefs. The wine came from Ethan's private vineyard. But the highlight wasn't the opulence. It was the sight of Catherine laughing freely, no longer carrying the weight of proving herself. When the night ended, Catherine and Ethan slipped away, not in a limo but in a vintage Aston Martin, the top down, the ocean breeze carrying them forward. From that night on, Catherine was no longer introduced as Arthur Vance's ex-wife. She was Catherine Reed Blackwell, business leader, philanthropist, and the woman who had taken her life back on her own terms. Her story became a legend, whispered in boardrooms and told over glasses of champagne at elite gatherings. Not because she married a billionaire, but because she had become one herself and had chosen a partner who matched her strength, not overshadowed it. Because Catherine had learned the truth. The sweetest revenge isn't just living well, it's building a life so full, so powerful, that the past can't touch it. All right, my friends. So that's where Catherine's story comes to a close. And if you're still here, listening all the way to the end, it means something in her journey has touched you. Maybe more than you expected. Maybe it reminded you of a moment when you felt small, overlooked, or underestimated. And maybe like Catherine, you're ready to reclaim your power. Life will always test us. With betrayals, with losses, with people who try to define us by their limited vision. But remember what the Stoics taught. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius. Catherine's victory wasn't about destroying Arthur. It was about building herself into someone whose worth couldn't be questioned. That's something you can do too, not by waiting for apologies, but by choosing to rise above and create the life you deserve. Maybe today, your version of taking back your power isn't a corporate takeover or marrying a billionaire. Maybe it's setting a boundary. Maybe it's leaving a toxic situation. Maybe it's finally saying, I am enough. Seneca once wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. That means much of what holds us back is the fear we feed ourselves. Catherine stopped feeding that fear. She chose action over doubt, vision over bitterness. And so can you. So as we close this chapter together, I want you to carry this thought. Power isn't given, it's taken, nurtured, and protected. And once you truly own it, no one can take it back from you. If Catherine's story made you feel something, if it inspired you even a little, I'd love for you to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that lift you up and remind you who you are. Because, my friends, your story isn't over yet, and the best chapters are still ahead.